Welcome to the Women Changing the World podcast, a podcast on a mission to bring you some of the most amazing women I know who are doing incredible things to generally make the world a better place. From corporate sustainability to straight up magic and everything in between, you'll meet the real life humans who are birthing the new. I'm your host, Liz Best, and I'm here to amplify the stories and voices of women who are changing the world. Today, I feel so unbelievably lucky to be sitting down with Maria Estrada, an educator, facilitator, and coach, to talk about so many important topics, including effective allyship, how to create containers that foster understanding and psychological safety, what justice really means, the role of fire in climate action, why we need to center Indigenous wisdom in climate work, concrete examples of the innovation that can come from diversity, and so much more. We talked about curiosity, privilege, and why her vision for a better future involves reminding ourselves relationship over task, which is something I intend to carry with me for a very long time. Maria has years of experience as a community leader and changemaker, a strategic planner and implementer of JEDI initiatives, and an academic and trainer of trainers to advance equity work in education and the environment. Her focus has been in designing tools and processes to center equity and inclusion and achieve more equitable outcomes in the work. Maria is a highly skilled and trusted facilitator, recognized for facilitating difficult dialogues across multiple differences and the complex power dynamics that emerge when our social identities enter into dynamic interaction. Maria's most recent post was as Deputy Director of Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Nature Conservancy. She led the group that built Equity by Design, an interactive tool for conservation practitioners to plan and implement equitable strategies. Previously, she was a faculty member at the University of Utah in the Education, Culture, and Society Department, one of the top social foundation programs in the country. She holds a PhD in education from ECS with an emphasis on political theater. In 2020, Maria was one of 250 women celebrated in a 5,000-foot public mural in downtown Salt Lake City. These women were featured for the positive impact they made in their communities. She is currently the chair of the board of Tracy Aviary and Botanical Garden, the oldest bird park in the nation. As the first woman of color in this role in the park's history, she is working to attract more diversity to the aviary while growing inclusive programs so all people in Utah can see this beautiful space as theirs. She is a lifetime member of the Utah Women's Giving Circle, a group of women who leverage modest individual donations into a powerful investment in projects that empower Utah women and girls. Maria is also a special advisor to the board of Men Healing, an organization dedicated to providing resources to men who have experienced sexual violence. There is so much wisdom and generosity in this conversation that I am so lucky to have gotten to have with Maria, and I am so excited for you to listen. I am so excited to have you here today, Maria. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to see you, Liz. Thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. I would love, before we jump in, Maria, if you wouldn't mind just briefly introducing yourself to our listeners.
My name is Maria Estrada, and a few things I want to say about what defines me. I am a mother first. I am an educator. I have devoted my life to thinking about issues of equity and justice. My heart has always been oriented towards these issues. I've always worried about the big questions in life. And the last thing that I would say that defined me is my immigration status. I grew up in Colombia, and I moved to the U.S. when I was 21 years old. That journey has shaped my life in multiple ways and has really made me the person that I am.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for that generous introduction and for bringing all your identities and yourself to our conversation. Maybe before we jump in, I would love for you to share a little bit about what you're up to these days, both personally and professionally.
Something that is really present right now is the work that's coming up for me in the next few months. In my work, I first try to keep up with the latest research around the issues that I already mentioned, around the latest thinking about equity and justice. And I work with both people and organizations, mostly designing curriculum tools so that the people and the organizations that I work with who are interested in being more inclusive and equitable can really advance this work. So I'll give you an example. This morning, I was speaking with a team in Latin America. They're working in 5 countries in Latin America, and they are moving from traditional to regenerative agriculture. So a lot of the work that I do is with environmental organizations. Regenerative agriculture is about farming and ranching in ways that nourish both people and nature. And the principles behind regenerative agriculture are meant to restore the soil, the health of ecosystems, addressing inequity in the agricultural industry, and leaving our land, our water, and climate in better shape for future generations. So the work that I will do with these folks will include, because, these are folks who come from 5 different countries in Latin America, and also their funders are in Europe, and they'll also be present in this meeting. We'll be getting on the same page about what we mean by equity, by justice, by inclusion. So this implies paying attention to our social historical context. This is something that I always begin with. We want to understand where each of us is coming from. All of us travel a unique path, a unique trajectory to get to, those convenings, to get to those meetings, to do, the collective work that we need to do. So I invite people to talk about their identities kind of in the way that I started. For example, there will be Indigenous women in the room. There will be European representatives from the funding agencies. There will be ecologists from Latin America. There will be social scientists from the US. So given those histories, given, our individual and collective trajectories, our places of origin, our language, our gender, our age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, we will each experience those meetings in very different ways. We are all seeking different outcomes. We all will have different needs in order to have a powerful, rich, effective experience. So one of the first things that I will do in coming together is create agreements. Because we are so different, because we will have such a different experience, I will ask the group, what do we each need from each other so that we can show up at our natural best, so that we can be open, so that we can be candid, so that we don't have to hide any essential parts of our identity, and so that we can take interpersonal risks. I'm going towards the idea of psychological safety. So what do we need from each other? So we can do all those things, ask difficult questions, express our concerns, express our needs, even a dissenting opinion, so that people won't be embarrassed, shamed, or isolated by the group for doing so. So that's, the first step towards centering inclusion, belonging, equity, justice. Again, realizing that we come from different places, that we will be having a different experience, that we all have different needs. I'm bringing folks together to have more thoughtful conversations about if we really want to be equitable, if we want to be inclusive, if we want to be just? What are the things, the processes, the practices, the ways of showing up so that we can have a rich, powerful, and effective collective experience?
I love how you described the way you approach both space holding and container setting in such a beautiful and thoughtful way. It's so important to acknowledge the different identities that we're bringing into the room. And I increasingly find that, and I feel like I've learned this gradually over the course of my career and even more rapidly felt it in my more recent career, that like time spent on introductions is time so well spent, especially when we're trying to create psychologically safe space to have really deep and meaningful, important conversations. And it's so exciting to hear how you're doing that for different groups to achieve different outcomes. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm curious, I know that you paused intentionally, and I didn't know if there was anything else you wanted to add about what you're up to these days before I ask you another question. I didn't want to just keep us rolling if there was more there.
Yeah, no, there is a lot more there. That's just the beginning. And intentionally, as you said, creating spaces where people can do good work together and where people can regard each other with respect and with love, even, so we can get to the outcomes that we want to accomplish. So, something else that I wanted to share with you is that we also begin with dialogue. So, a number of definitions that we want to be clear about. We want a shared vocabulary. We want shared frameworks so that when we speak to one another across, those multiple differences, we can understand each other. So the idea of dialogue for me is really critical for a just process. I think dialogue and justice are deeply connected because justice has a number of components. The one that we think about more immediately is the distributional idea around justice, that in this work of environmental conservation, that the risks and the benefits of doing that work are equally distributed. That's one of the components of just work. However, there are a couple other components. One is the procedural component. So who is at the table? Are they invited with equal power, with equal voice, with equal vote? That's the procedural aspect, right? Because we're going to make decisions about the distribution of those risks and those benefits. But the place where dialogue is really connected deeply to the idea of justice is in the part of justice that's about recognition of the other, the recognitional piece of justice. Do we, around that table, across each other and across those differences, do we regard each other as equals, as equally deserving, right, of the same amount of power, the same amount of voice and vote? And so for that, we need to be intentional in the multiple skills that come with dialogue. And one of them is suspending our judgment of each other. We are socialized to judge. We acquire a number of biases in that trajectory that I already named, that the unique trajectory that we travel to get to our convenings, to get to our relationships. And so I invite folks to accept that there is bias, that there is judgment, and that it gets in between our relationships. And it really is a barrier to seeing each other clearly. So I invite folks to notice when we are judging, to be gentle with each other. It's just part of our human experience, but to practice, because a lot of this work of equity and justice is about practicing. So practice suspending the judgment that comes up and getting curious about, those trajectories, the stories that we bring. What if we, instead of judging, get curious about what we can discover about the other, about ourselves? So that is one of the practices in setting up the skills around dialogue. Another practice of dialogue is to ask questions, to surface our assumptions. Sometimes, we meet people and we make up stories about who they are or why they do what they do. And so I invite folks to ask questions of curiosity with childlike wonder, as if the other is treasure. And the more we ask and the more we learn, the richer we become. Another skill around dialogue is to share our own truth. Sometimes we recognize ourselves in the other and to connect, around those shared experiences. An important exercise, in the beginning in doing this work as well, is exploring our cultural differences, because that's connected to judgment. We all grow up in different contexts. We all come with different histories. And so we explore the dimensions of our culture, right? For example, our notions of time. Some of us, I in the US, have learned to understand time as money, as not wasting people's time, being effective and to the point, doing what we came to do. And yet I came from a culture where notions of time are very different. Time is abundant, time is cyclical, people do things in due time. And there are multiple facets of our culture, notions, how we communicate with each other, whether we are hierarchical or we are more of a flat, democratic group. And so I invite folks to explore, those differences so that we can understand them and negotiate around cultural differences instead of what we usually do, which is judge people when those cultural differences are not visible, when we haven't disclosed them to one another, when we haven't had those conversations about how we are going to negotiate across what are just cultural differences, not things that we need to judge. So, little by little, creating those skills and those practices that really will allow us to see each other more clearly, to have shared understandings. That will get us to more effective, rich outcomes.
Absolutely. That's so beautiful. So appreciate how thoughtfully you described that. And I'm so struck by the extent to which I know I've had the benefit of participating in some really beautiful spaces that have taken the time for conversations like this and curiosity. And I also am struck by, unfortunately, how infrequently I've experienced that in professional context as part of how we begin the dialogue. And yeah, we need so much more, I think, of the work that you're doing. And I find your story about how you've woven an incredible career really at the intersection of climate and regeneration and equity and facilitation. I'm curious because I know you have such a beautiful story of how you came to be here. How did you get to where you are today, and what's inspiring you about doing this work in this moment?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that I named, a number of my experiences and my identities and how they've shaped me. I migrated, at a very young age, and from a country, Colombia, that at the time in the late 80s was consumed in a war, and it was, the drug war. And I don't want to get into a lot of details about that, but I do want to say that that was part of the reason why I wanted to extract myself from that context. It was a violent context at that time in my late teens, my early 20s, both externally and internal to the home. So that was sort of the impetus. And a really formative experience that I think is part of the reason why I am interested in these questions. Navigating the immigration system in the US is another very formative experience. It was difficult. It was decades long of moving from student status to having a temporary working visa to looking for a more stable status and really confronting a lot of impediments, a lot of barriers in the process. I even was given a deportation order when I was already in a PhD program here at the University of Utah. And I think that's a pivotal experience for me because I experienced what effective allyship is. So that navigating all those obstacles, that longing for a more stable immigration status, that moving across cultures and not being from there anymore, and the perennial foreigner here, all of that informs what I've been sharing with you, and my emphasis and my focus on relationship before task, trying to bridge the two cultures that I come from and use the best of both in bringing people together to, think deeply about these questions of creating a more just world through the work that we do. Then, finishing a PhD that was after being able to, with the allyship of a lot of my mentors and my professors at the University of Utah, being able to remain in the country. I was given an extension of my student visa so that I could finish my PhD. And the focus of that PhD was on social justice. It was a program in both education and political theater. I was surrounded by folks that were asking similar questions and having been given the time to write and to think about, what I was seeing, what I was experiencing, and what I wanted to make of those understandings of my learning. What do I do with this, right? How do I move from knowing to doing? Then I got an offer from a mentor of mine to come and explore a work in a large environmental organization that eventually became about what does equity and justice mean in environmental work, and looking for early adapters. This was in the, I want to say, mid 2000s, when these sort of questions within the environmental movement were new. So looking for early adopters, finding who were the folks who were already not only thinking about these questions, but doing. And one of those early adopters was a network in North America that is doing work with fire and in partnership with Indigenous groups. They were really thinking deeply about what justice and equity look like in partnering with Indigenous peoples as a large, very wealthy, very white environmental organizations. And I think one of the answers was humility, something new for an organization that is science-based, that was already doing really interesting and powerful work in that area, but understanding that Indigenous folks have been doing this work for a lot longer, and that in the partnering with Indigenous folks, perhaps the organization could take a step back and let those indigenous leaders lead in this work. So that was in that early work within the environment. Again, another formative experience where I learned a lot about fire, a lot about the work that Indigenous people have been doing for millennia, and how might we partner in ways that feel respectful, that bring both science and traditional ecological knowledge to the same level, and creating sort of a third thing that comes out of those two spheres of understanding that centers equity and justice.
It's such a beautiful story, and I so appreciate you sharing so openly, having observed from countless friends and clients and colleagues how challenging the immigration process is in this country. And it's wild, and it can be so unfairly difficult to navigate from what I've observed. I so appreciate you sharing that and grounding us there. You mentioned effective allyship when you were talking about that journey. I feel like there's so many threads in what you just said that I'm
Yeah.
excited to pull, but I'd love to maybe start there with effective allyship and what that means to you. How can we show up as better allies in our lives and in our work?
Yeah, that's a big theme that runs across a lot of the work that I do. I think we're building leadership for these times where allyship is a critical piece of that leadership. So I will tell you how I define it. I think that allyship is taking responsibility as individuals for actively advancing the rights and the inclusion of people who are different from us. And I'm going to spell out that difference. But that actively advancing is through conscious, through positive, through skill based, and through sustained efforts. So it's not, a one time thing, but it's a commitment, a lifetime commitment to doing the work of lifting others and removing barriers for opportunity, for participation, for a life well lived for those who historically have been marginalized, by multiple systems. So that's the definition. And I usually talk about the practices again of being an effective ally. And I think the first and most important one is to understand at the intersection of our multiple identities, where do we have power? Because part of being an ally is leveraging the power that we have. So I'm going to use myself as an example, but I can also return to my story at the university. But I am a well-educated individual. As I've already shared, I've had the opportunities provided and barriers for access removed by allies so that I was able to complete a PhD. And that is a lever of power for me. I'm also living in a city where there's a lot of Latino, Latina, Latinx immigrants, many of them undocumented. And today, after my navigating the immigration system, I'm a citizen. So vis-a-vis folks who are undocumented, I have that power and that lever that I can pull in some situations to, advance the rights of others. I'm a cisgender woman, and, transgender folks these days are fighting for the right to exist in this society. So I have a lever as a cisgender woman that I can use in allyship, standing up with and for the rights of transgender people. And I can go on and on as someone who's not living with any physical disabilities. I have a power. So to give you a couple of examples about how awareness of our power is probably the most important trait of an effective ally. One of the people that helped me when I was given a deportation order was one of my professors and mentors at the University of Utah. Vis-a-vis his status as a citizen, as a full professor at the University of Utah at the time, right? As an immigrant whose immigration status was being removed as a student, he was in a power up. He advocated for me. He wrote a number of letters. He called influencers. That's how we were able to be granted an extension of my status as a student to finish my PhD. So he was a really powerful and effective ally in that moment because he took personal responsibility for standing up with me through a conscious effort, through a positive effort, through a sustained effort. This took almost a year, to really transform the trajectory of my life, right? He allowed me to continue here, to finish my studies. So that's, an example of a powerful and effective ally.
Oh, I so appreciate how you framed the levers that we have access to and how we can develop the awareness of what levers we have access to. I was just going to echo and offer, I think one of my favorite things that I've learned in my own decolonization journey over the past few years was specifically from Emily Ann Brandt, who I deeply respect and admire, is that privilege is responsibility. We aren't drawing attention to privilege to shame people, but when we have privilege, it's an opportunity to recognize the responsibility that comes with privilege. And I just so appreciate how beautifully you illustrated what that can look like to take responsibility for the privileges that we have.
Thank you for that rewarding. Yeah. We tend to focus on the aspects of our identity that are powered down. And we forget that it's nuanced depending on the context. We can be in situations where our power shifts from power down to power up. You know, I like to give the example of when I go back to Colombia, as a woman in Colombia, throughout my life, I clearly got the message that men were more valuable, more valued by that context, by that society. So if I go to Colombia, let's say I go to a meeting in Colombia and I'm in the minority or the only woman in the room, I'm conscious that I am powered down to those men. You know, I'm not going to be the one they seek to say, open the meeting or to have the last word, or they won't seek my expertise. Unless, you know, I like to say, those folks are Spanish speaking and there is information, critical information to be had in English. And I am an English speaker, right? In that context where I was initially powered down because of my gender, I turn power up. And, you know, I can remove that barrier for access by interpreting, translating, or not, right? I can choose how I pull that lever or not. So it's very contextual. And we have to be, if we want to be allies, we have to be attentive to power dynamics in the room, how they can shift when there is a need, you know, to remove a barrier for access, for participation, for voice, for vote, and act in transformative ways. And that's not, you know, the only trait of an effective ally. There is another thing that I think as allies we are obligated to do, and that is to understand that not all of us are experiencing the world in the same way. That, you know, a Latina woman in my community who is undocumented, who hasn't had the access that I have had to education, you know, is having a very different experience. For example, navigating the education system for her children. And so I need to educate myself about what that experience is like if I'm interested, you know, in being an effective ally. Not only educate myself, but also listen to those folks who might be in that context powered down to me and understand that experience. And more importantly, believe that experience, believe that it's different from mine. So doing our homework, listening is another critical piece of being effective allies. Another piece around power is that we can speak up, but not over the voices of the people we want to be in allyship with. Again, it's part of understanding the dynamics of power and when your voice might be useful and when it might not. It might be actually silencing or interrupting somebody else's voice. And, you know, it's fraught work. It's difficult work, and we're going to make mistakes. And we might step over or speak over somebody, and we might be given feedback. And I think another trait of an effective ally is resilience in a situation like that, when perhaps our impact was different from our intent, to say I'm sorry, to say I'm learning, I want to be a good ally, and I'll do better next time. I think it's critical, and not to recoil, right? When we make a mistake and we get feedback from those folks that we want to stand in allyship with. And finally, that allyship is a verb, right? One of the people in one of our workshops said something that was so on point. She said, if there was a membership card for allies, it would expire every night at midnight. So this is work that we choose to do every day, right?
Totally. Oh, yes. I so love and appreciate that. And I also really appreciate your highlighting the willingness to show up and try and potentially get it wrong and take the feedback and apologize and move forward, as opposed to trying to get it perfect to get any, like, there's no check mark. Like, this is not a checkbox exercise. Like, that perfectionism is itself a part of the white supremacy that I know so many of us are working to divest from. I feel like one thing we would be so remiss not to talk about while we're here is something that really, really struck me, Maria, the first time that we connected. We were talking about some of your other facilitation work and your work around like fire and working with women firefighters and bringing more Indigenous wisdom around fire into climate resilience and regeneration. And you touched on this a little bit in sharing your story, but it feels so essential that we do a much, much, much better job of centering Indigenous wisdom in climate action. And I'm curious if you could share, maybe to start, just a little bit more about like where you are seeing this happen today. And then would love to get maybe more into the specifics around fires.
Yes, thank you for that question, Liz. I did want to talk about that because it's today the most interesting work that I do. When this work started for me within the environmental sphere, the people doing firework were first adopters, really interested in what did this mean in the context of that work. So I think one thing that I want to say is, and I've learned so much with the people that I've worked with, is that fire has always been part of the landscape, always part of the cycle of a lot of ecosystems. Fire, just to go into a little very brief definition of how we're looking at fire in this work, is essential. Fire reduces dead vegetation, stimulates new growth in forests, it improves habitat for wildlife, and it's been in practice for millennia, particularly, the indigenous folks in North America. It's also been, because they see themselves as part of nature, as part of creation, it's also have been a spiritual practice. I've heard the term before, socio and ecological medicine, right? Medicine for nature and people as part of being part of nature. And during the colonial era, and I love how you talked about, decolonizing our minds and our ways of being and showing up in the world. These indigenous ways of being in the landscapes, of managing the landscapes, were misunderstood, and worse, they were maligned and they were violently suppressed. And today we live with the consequences of that misunderstanding, but also the violence of colonization and the suppression of not only fire, but of the indigenous folks who sought to maintain those traditional spiritual burning practices. Indigenous folks were harmed. They were beaten, even shot, when they wanted to continue these practices. And it's only relatively recently that we've understood, land managers, conservationists, that the use of this fire to reduce fuels, to bring more technical language, to combat biodiversity loss, to promote forest health, will be critical in our efforts to heal the planet. And so it is important, and I've learned this through my work with indigenous folks, that we don't continue this colonialist patterns of erasure of those indigenous traditions and practices, and instead regularly acknowledge, uplift, support the intellectual and cultural origins of fire, of prescribed fires. So I have been so grateful to be invited into these spaces sometimes, with Indigenous folks. Like we had a gathering in Northern California where that spiritual practice was central. And so this is back to the idea of equitable and just partnerships, right? Where a large, white, wealthy environmental organization will enter into a partnership, but they will say, we want you to lead. You've been doing this work for a long time. You have a lot of wisdom that we desperately need, supporting and following from behind. And it's been really powerful to see that those two very different organizations will come together and will center the spiritual practices, which is not something that you do a white, large environmental organization do. The other piece, thinking about equity and history, is that work has been, after contact, the colonial way has been dominated by men. And part of bringing and centering equity is bringing women back into the work. I mean, in the Indigenous context, that was always part of the process. But now that it's U.S. organizations, the ones that are doing this work, we're creating awareness of the critical role of women in this work. And so creating spaces where women can develop different ways of doing the work, the different ways of leading the work. And what I've seen by coming to facilitate those spaces for women is that women are bringing, this is the power of diversity, women are bringing innovations into the field that are really important and really critical and that we hadn't seen, in a field that had been dominated by men. And so it's been a very rewarding experience in the sense that these folks that come with the intention to create spaces where all can participate fully, where all can, bring their own wisdom, where we support each other. It's just been really rewarding to see what happens, right? When you are intentional about creating spaces where different ways of being, different ways of doing, different ways of leading create, this very effective events. I can go into more detail about what those events look like, but what I will say in closing is that it's healing work. Not only are we healing the landscapes and ecosystems, but we are healing each other and seeing each other fully, in supporting each other, in learning from each other. There isn't work that is as powerful to me in the context where I work, because I think that if we want to heal the planet, that really goes hand in hand with healing our relationships with each other. I mean, it's the same energy that we will need moving forward, that energy of loving and embracing and including and accepting how all of us, bring different things to an event like this.
Oh my goodness. I couldn't agree more. The power of community and the power of healing ourselves and our relationship to each other. Like, I love Rebecca McGee often reminds me that we are nature too. And I so appreciate, Maria, how you articulated the connection between healing these relationships, being in community, and the work that so many of us are doing to preserve our planet for future generations. I could talk to you all day. I would love to talk to you all day. I also want to be respectful of your time. And so, in the interest of asking one more question, I'm so excited to hear your thoughts and answer and perspective on when you think about a better future and the better future that so many of us are bringing our best to create. What is your vision for what a better future will look like?
That's a beautiful question. Thank you. And thank you for being thoughtful interviewer. I think I mentioned already, one of the dimensions of culture that we explore when we're trying to understand who's in the room, where they come from, what do they bring, what are their stories, what are their needs, what are their strengths. We talk about relationship before task as one way of approaching our work together, whatever work we do. I see that the problems that we're facing are so urgent that we go to task and we don't think about our relationships. I'm not convinced of a lot of things, but this thing I know, and that is that, and you mentioned it too, we have to put the time before the task to understand who's in the room, to see each other clearly, to create some agreements. That question of what do we need from one another here in the time that we're going to be doing this together so that we can bring our best forward, so that we can be open, be candid, be the best that we can be, take interpersonal risks together without any fear, right? That we're going to be shamed or punished by the group, and build those connections, build a shared language, build a shared understanding, hear what each other need, make sure that we center justice, that we see each other across our humanity, that we regard each other as equals, that we take responsibility for advancing the rights of everyone across our multiple differences, that we leverage our power in service of seeing transformation for others. So all of that is attending to individuals, to our relationships first, because a lot of things in the urgent work that we all do are gonna go off the rails. We're gonna encounter friction. We're going to encounter differences of opinion, differences of approaches. But if we have those relationships, if we take the time to build respect for one another, trust with one another, when those difficulties come, we will have a circle of safety that we've created that we can call each other back into and continue moving forward. But what I see often is that we go to task first, and it's really difficult to work with people that you can't see clearly, that you can't understand clearly, that you don't respect, that you don't trust, that you don't have regard for. And so I believe that's one way, right, in which we can create a better future for each other. And that is taking the time to build the conditions where we can do our most courageous, our best work together. But it takes time. It takes resources. And I'm afraid that, we don't take that time to do that. We go straight into task. So that's my small proposal for a better future. Build all those things that I've already mentioned, inclusion, belonging, a notion of what's just and what's equitable, and a collective vision of where we want to go together. And we have a much better chance if we have built trust and regard and love for each other.
I so love and appreciate the reminder for relationship over task. Simple and succinct. And I know it can be so easy to forget and get caught up in the to-do or the agenda. And so I will be carrying that reminder with me. I so appreciate how beautifully you articulated that. For people who are listening who are like, oh my goodness, I need more of this woman's brilliance in my life, is there a good place for people to find you or follow you or keep up with you?
LinkedIn is probably the best place. I'm building more of a presence on Instagram, Maria Estrada. But LinkedIn for now is probably the best place. I also can leave my email if folks want to connect. Is Maria at thecollective180.com. And, if anybody has any feedback, anybody wants to engage in conversation, I'm happy to do that. I know that your work, the work that you're doing, reaches a lot of women. I'm grateful for the work that you're doing, connecting women, lifting women's voices. So it would be lovely to be in touch with women who are doing similar work with different interests. So thank you for letting me leave my contact information. And yeah, we can remain connected, maybe create more networks of women who are changing the world. I'm so, so very appreciative and grateful of the way you go about doing this with so much kindness and thoughtfulness and intention. I loved your questions today. I wish you the best with the other conversations that you will have.
Thank you so much, Maria. I so appreciate that generous reflection. And I'm so grateful to be in community with you and just really appreciate the opportunity to share your brilliance with the world. Thank you so much for being here today.
You're so welcome.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Women Changing the World podcast. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you're currently listening to it. And don't forget to subscribe for future episodes. You can find me on Instagram at liz.best, that's lis.best, and you can find Girls Club Collective at girls_club_collective. You can also find us on LinkedIn by searching for Liz Best, that's my name, LISBEST, and Girls Club Collective. Join our mail list by visiting the Girls Club Collective homepage and scrolling down to the bottom. You'll be in the loop on upcoming events, retreats, and opportunities to make magic with us, and you'll also receive a monthly love note from my heart to your inbox. I am so excited to keep in touch.